We're working our way through different ways that scholars have dealt with the issue of Old Testament violence. Today we're going to look at a scholar named Tremper Longman, who wrote a book called Confronting Old Testament Controversies. He has a great chapter in here on specifically our subject, and so we're going to look at his argument in this video. To begin, Longman argues that throughout the whole Bible, we're given this portrait of a God who is constantly fighting to defeat evil in our world, and that this is a process. He splits this process of God defeating evil in our world in 5 steps. First of all, phase 1, he says God fights the flesh and blood enemies of Israel. We see this in the Canaanite conquest narrative, specifically in the book of Joshua, where God is fighting both with and for his people, conquering the land of Canaan. Then we move to phase 2, where God fights Israel. This is seen most prominently towards the end of the Old Testament narrative, where Israel is exiled, where God is actually fighting against his own people. And where this is important, and this is crucial to understanding Longman's argument, is God is trying to defeat sin. He's trying to defeat evil and wickedness. It's not as much the ethnicity that he's fighting against as much as sin and evil itself. So even when God's chosen people, Israel, are behaving in a way that is wrong, God will bring judgment against that. So harem warfare, which we talked about in the last video from John Goldingay, and this is this idea of devoting everything to destruction. Longman argues that it is not really having to do much with ethnicity as much as God wanting to bring a judgment against sin. So that's phase 2, God fights Israel. Phase 3, God will come and fight Israel's oppressors. This is seen especially in the prophetic books in the both exilic and then post-exilic era or period, as Israel is continually oppressed by foreign nations. And God promises Israel, his people, that one day he is going to come and defeat these foreign nations. And there's even a lot of violent imagery in these prophetic texts. So Israel is in this period of waiting as the Old Testament comes to a close, both waiting but also expecting for God to come and to move. Which brings us to phase 4, which is when Jesus shows up. In this phase, he calls Jesus fights spiritual powers and authorities. That on the cross, Jesus actually overcomes evil, overcomes Satan and the forces of darkness by his own death on a cross. And this is a victory that he calls already and not yet, which is a phrase that scholars will use quite often, that God's kingdom is here already, but not yet in its fullness, that even Satan himself is defeated already, but he's still able to persist in our world. And so finally, phase 5 is when Jesus wins the final battle. Jesus is going to return and will eliminate both human and spiritual enemies. He points to the book of Revelation, which uses figurative language, but he argues that it points to a very real reality where evil will be defeated once and for all. And even this is through violence on the part of God and on the part of Jesus. So he argues that we live in between phases 4 and 5. Jesus has come, he's won the victory on the cross, but we're still waiting for that final victory when Jesus returns. And because we live at this moment in history, we are not allowed, he says, to go and look at these Old Testament passages where God commands his people to go and destroy a group of people. He says, we're not living at that time. We're living in between phases 4 and 5, which is why, and this is how he makes sense of then Jesus' command to love your enemy. It's because we're living at the time that we are, that's our role. That's our responsibility, is to love our enemy. And that the real forces of darkness, those are the ones that we want to come against. But all people we're supposed to love, even if they make themselves our enemy. And so we are supposed to leave all judgment to the hands of God, who will return, and he sees that as a very violent judgment day coming in the future. And so overall, Longman is able, kind of the main point, violence is found throughout the Bible. That's something that we can't doubt, but in different contexts and to different extents. But through all of this, we always see God's persistence that violence must be defeated, evil must be eradicated, and so God will always bring his judgment upon that. So that's Longman's overarching argument dealing with Old Testament violence.